Geoffrey, people and organisations can be prosecuted for knowingly withholding information from police and or hindering criminal investigations. How is it that the Catholic Church manages to avoid prosecution for hiding clergy who are alleged to have been abusing children?
The Catholic Church avoids prosecution because it deals with these matters under canon law. First of all, and my researches show that the Vatican has trafficked in paedophile priests. If a paedophile priest is caught in Belgium, very often they're not handed over to the national law. They're moved silently to some place in Africa or Latin America, and of course they offend again. The other problem with the way the Catholic Church has been operating, and I stress this is the Vatican, the command centre of the Catholic Church, has been refusing to hand over paedophile priests to law enforcement agencies. There was a famous case a few years ago where a bishop in France was actually convicted for not allowing a paedophile priest or not handing him over to the authorities. He went on and he raped more children. And we've had three legal inquiries in Ireland where they found that abuse in Catholic boys' schools was endemic. It happened, that was their word. It happened all the time. In Belgium, it's been admitted to be endemic in every parish. In Germany, in Malta, in the Philippines, tens of thousands of children have been raped, let's not mince words, children can't give consent, by paedophile priests. And what I've been calling for accountability is that I want the Vatican to accept the rules of the Convention on the Rights of Children, which every country in the world has signed, except for America, which doesn't sign conventions. And then we can, because that says that the Church has to put the interests of children first, above the reputation or wealth of the Church, that there has to be a zero-tolerance policy for Catholic priests who molest children, one strike against a child and you're out, and there has to be mandatory reporting, namely reporting to the police whenever a bishop gets evidence. Now, the Pope has come some distance. In Easter, he said, this is petty gossip. It's not petty, and it's not gossip. A few weeks ago in Britain, at last, he offered an apology for what he called the unspeakable crimes of my clergy. He's got to go further, I think.
Well, I'm not going to let you go further right at the moment because we've got other panellists. So
okay.
I want to hear from Paul Kelly on this subject.
Well, I think the question, Tony, is exactly how the Pope is to be held accountable and what the fundamental issue is. Is the fundamental issue child sexual abuse, or is the fundamental issue the Catholic Church? I mean, the point about this is that child sexual abuse is a universal problem. It arises in families, tribes, cultures. In fact, it arises in virtually every male-dominated institution of the 20th century, whether one's talking about boarding schools, various religious denominations, the Boy Scouts. Now, the question is this. Are we interested primarily in the problem of child sexual abuse or targeting the Catholic Church, making a political decision to select the Catholic Church and target the Catholic Church? Now, there's also a second issue here which I think is more important. It's been suggested by some that the Pope should be put in the dock on this in the international criminal justice system. Now, the point I'd make about this is the international criminal justice system is for war crimes. That's what it's for. It's for leaders and tyrants and generals who incite and plan genocide or war crimes en masse. The point to make about the Pope is that the Pope has not raped any children. The Pope has not organised child sexual abuse. He actually opposes this evil, and of course it is an evil, and there have been cover-ups. The real question is whether international law should be stretched sufficiently to put the Pope in the dock when these measures are essentially for war criminals. And I think you've got to ask yourself, what would be the consequences if this was to happen? Well, this would define the international criminal justice system. I think it would discredit international law. It would damage the International Criminal Court. It would lead to divisions internationally. But above all, I argue that it would do nothing for the victims of child sexual abuse.
I want to hear from the rest of our panellists. I know Geoffrey Robertson's burning to get back to that question, but I do want to hear Tariq Ali on this briefly.
Well, I think the Church is a special institution and it has a head. And the head of the Catholic Church is called the Pope. So when within this institution you have a breach of the liberties of children, then someone has to be answerable. And there's absolutely no doubt, Geoffrey's right on this, that the Vatican has been engaging in a huge cover-up over the last 3, 4, God knows how many decades, country after country. And Paul, you're right, it's not only the Catholic Church. There was a big, in the 70s at the Kincora Boys' Home in Ulster, Protestant priests and Protestants behaved in exactly the same way, which doesn't make it justifiable for the Catholics to carry on doing it. So someone has to be answerable. Whether the Pope is tried, in which court he's tried, is an open question. But I think that, some questions have to be answered, and the Pope is the person to answer them, just because he leads this church, but previous popes should have been held accountable too. I mean, the other problem is that this goes on the one hand, massive hypocrisy, and at the same time the Church says that homosexuality is impermissible.
Lenore, do you have any thoughts on whether the Pope should be accountable?
I'm not sure about the Pope being accountable, but I think mandatory reporting is obviously needed. I mean, my sons are Boy Scouts, and if there was a pedophile Boy Scout leader, I would definitely want him to be handed over to the authorities, not just talking to whoever the head of the Boy Scouts is.
Rati.
I think that rape is still a stigma in society. It's there's a stereotype that rape only happens between certain circumstances, war, conflict, and there's been so much push under the carpet. I'd like to see the role of communities putting pressure at the local parish level where this happens, because I think if you keep pushing on the top and you don't push on the bottom, it's not going to get somewhere.
Do you think it's wrong to push at the top?
It's okay, but you're not going to get anywhere, because the conversation's limited to very clever lawyers like Geoffrey up there, right? You need the community down there to start pushing. And you need mums like myself and Lenore to be aware and to be active and campaigning on this, putting pressure on the perpetrators.
All right, there's a specific question to Geoffrey Robertson on this.
Mr. Robertson, you, like many in the New Atheist movement, seem hell-bent on the idea that religion should not be privileged in such a way as to provide grounds for legal immunity. Regardless of whether the Pope has committed crimes against humanity, he is still entitled to head of state immunity under international law, being the head of state of the Vatican. In light of this, doesn't your argument therefore reveal itself to be nothing more than anti-Catholic legal hucksterism?
Well, I'm not an atheist, I'm a lawyer.
I'd like to get you to describe the distinction.
Well, I can see both sides. Now, what I will say to you is this. I don't agree, and Alan Dershowitz didn't agree when he agreed with me, that the Vatican is not a real state. It's a palace with gardens. It's as big as a golf course. And it's a real state in international law has to have a permanent population. There are no Vaticanians. There are a few dozen celibate priests. No one gets born in the Vatican except by unfortunate accident. So it's not a real state. And if the Pope is negligent, if the Vatican is negligent in moving a paedophile priest to another country, to fresh fields, to unsuspecting flocks, then of course he should be sued, or the Vatican, the Holy See, should be sued for negligence. So that's one way of making him accountable. I'm not actually anti-Catholic. I work a lot with Catholic groups against the death penalty. We'll be talking about that later, I guess. I greatly salute the work that Catholic organizations do in Africa, where I've been working. But that is... And they are losing out because of the reaction. The Holy See will not act against child abuse. It continues to cover up. It continues to use canon law. And canon law there's no cross-examination, there's no DNA testing, there is no punishment. What happens under canon law is that the guilty priest, who may have molested dozens of children, is asked to do penance, is asked to pray for the victims. Victims don't want prayers, they want justice, and they want to ensure that the molester doesn't do it again. I've been inspired by a priest from Dapto who had to go to the newspapers to tell on the paedophile ring that James Wood later investigated. And he said when he was ostracized and eventually committed suicide, but when he was asked, how can you rat on a brother? He said, no paedophile is a brother of mine. And that is the principle I would wish the Church to take on board. Mary MacKillop was excommunicated for dobbing in a priest.
I'm just going to interrupt you there, and I'm going to bring you back to the point that Paul Kelly made, because it does seem to me that you are the person in the world who's making the case that popes should be made accountable for crimes against humanity, as you put it in your article in The Guardian. Do you believe the Pope should be indicted for those crimes or not?
No, I don't.
You're making slippery legal arguments
that
perhaps he should be, but you're not prepared to commit
Children's
to actually saying that.
He should be accountable, first of all, to the Children's Convention, which requires that in every state that those who commit crimes against children should be handed over to the police and should be dealt with, and that the interests of children should be put first. That, I believe, is international law, and that is the first law I want him held accountable to.
But you did raise the question of crimes against humanity very specifically. Do these breaches, widespread as they may be, amount to crimes against humanity?
The definition of a crime against humanity, and I don't want to get into legal problems, is that it should be widespread and systematic. And they are the words that have been used in Belgium, used in Ireland by judicial commissions. There is no question, I'm sorry, Paul, that crimes against humanity can be committed in peacetime as well as in war. In Kenya at the moment, we have the ICC investigating electoral violence. It's been voted on. Australia voted in favour of making crimes against humanity committed in peacetime. But I will tell you this, and this is the point of articulating a dangerous idea. Because it's a dangerous idea, people will act to avert the danger. And I have every confidence that the Pope, having come a long way in 4 months, will come further and will change the law of the Vatican so as there will be zero tolerance and there will be mandatory reporting.
All right, Paul Kelly.
Look, there are two fundamental principles which should guide this debate, Tony. The first, which the Catholic Church has been in breach of for a long period of time, which it's now rectifying, is that Catholic priests guilty of child sexual abuse have got to be subject to the full force of the civil and criminal law. And the Church cannot try and dodge that reality. Now, that is the fundamental principle here. Now, as far as I understand the situation, I mean, certainly that applies in this country, it applies in Australia, it applies in the United States. We see priests being put on trial for these offences. So that is the first principle. The second principle is, in relation to the Church's internal affairs, the state has got to be very careful about intervening in the internal affairs and workings of the Church. That is, if you like, confusing the separation between church and state. Now, some people have been arguing for that. That is a false principle. Provided that people, clergy, guilty of these offences are given the full force of the normal law, then there is no need for the state to intervene in the affairs of the Church. The final point is, I'm very interested that Geoffrey said that he doesn't want to put the Pope in the dock. And I think that is an important point. But in relation to this, we need to be very careful of some of these arguments, because the argument has been mounted that there should be a threat to the Pope, and that the idea of threatening the Pope with international legal action will encourage reform in the Church. This is a complete illusion. This is a complete nonsense. I mean, essentially, there's been quite a lot of reform in the Church to this stage, and it misunderstands the activities and machinery of the church on the one hand, and I think it's quite wrong to start running around threatening people with the force of international law simply to improve their behaviour.
OK, I'm going to move on from this subject in just a moment, but I think Geoffrey Robertson does deserve a quick response. A quick response to that.
Very quickly, tens of thousands of children have been raped by priests. The Church has covered up. The Church has trafficked. The Vatican has trafficked priests, as Paul accepts, from one country to another. That has to stop. The only way of stopping it is to point out, as I've pointed out in my book, The Case of the Pope, that widespread and systematic child abuse is a crime if, under the command responsibility principle, if you've got the power to stop it and to punish the perpetrators, you've got a duty to do that.
OK, you're watching Q&A? And listening to the applause as well. Live at the Sydney Opera House.
Mandatory reporting, namely reporting to the police whenever a bishop gets evidence. Now, the Pope has come some distance. In Easter, he said, this is petty gossip. It's not petty, and it's not gossip. A few weeks ago in Britain, at last, he offered an apology for what he called the unspeakable crimes of my clergy. He's got to go further, I think.
Well, I'm not going to let you go further right at the moment because we've got other panellists. So I want to hear from Paul Kelly on this subject.
Well, I think the question, Tony, is exactly...
Geoffrey, people and organisations can be prosecuted for knowingly withholding information from police and or hindering criminal investigations. How is it that the Catholic Church manages to avoid prosecution for hiding clergy who are alleged to have been abusing children?
The Catholic Church avoids prosecution because it deals with these matters under canon law. First of all, and my researches show that the Vatican has trafficked in paedophile priests. If a paedophile priest is caught in Belgium, very often they're not handed over to the national law. They're moved silently to some place in Africa or Latin America, and of course they offend again. The other problem with the way the Catholic Church has been operating, and I stress this is the Vatican, the command centre of the Catholic Church, has been refusing to hand over paedophile priests to law enforcement agencies. There was a famous case a few years ago where a bishop in France was actually convicted for not allowing a paedophile priest or not handing him over. Is that I want the Vatican to accept the rules of the Convention on the Rights of Children, which every country in the world has signed, except for America, which doesn't sign conventions. And then we can, because that says that the Church has to put the interests of children first, above the reputation or wealth of the Church, that there has to be a zero-tolerance policy for Catholic priests who molest children, one strike against a child and you're out, and there has to be to the authorities. He went on and he raped more children. And we've had three legal inquiries in Ireland where they found that abuse in Catholic boys' schools was endemic. It happened, that was their word. It happened all the time. In Belgium, it's been admitted to be endemic in every parish. In Germany, in Malta, in the Philippines, tens of thousands of children have been raped, let's not mince words, children can't give consent, by paedophile priests. And what I've been calling for accountability